Dear colleagues and friends of the Bacau-Ricci Institute at the University of St. Joseph, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome you very warmly to today's event, our forum on a very demanding topic on Gregory from Nyssa. So let me warmly welcome our speaker, Professor Sonia Xia, among us, Professor of Theology at the Faculty of Religious Studies and Philosophy of the University of St. Joseph, and also Father Vic Aguilar, who kindly agreed to be the respondent of today. The friends, of course, of the Ricci Institute recognize Father Vic as our pop star. He was drawing crowds, but also you will see how impressive Professor Sonia is. So the background of our choice is that we had a journey along the Ignatian year reflecting on spiritual transformation in times of crisis. So we see also this event tonight on this journey, of course, to be very vigorous in our academic analysis. What is the theology and the wisdom of Gregory of Nyssa, but also what can we learn as we are challenged by different crises, especially also COVID, and how we can respond to it. So we have the procedure is that we have first the conference by Professor Sonia, then the response from Father Vic, who is also a specialist on these Cappadocian Fathers, and feel welcome also during the conference to post your questions in the chat room. You see below there is a chat room where you are welcome to ask any questions you're interested. So without further ado, I give over to Professor Sonia Xia. Thanks very much for being available to share your insights on this very demanding topic of mystical theology. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Stephen. I have to say this is a quite challenging topic to make a connection of church father from so remote a time ago to the crisis nowadays. But yes, I think during this process, I also learned a lot myself. So I want to share it with all of you here today. Yes, so let me first share my screen. Okay, so I guess all of you can see my screen now. Yes. Okay, so if so, then yeah, we start. So my topic to share today is a reflection on the COVID-19, the pandemic, but from Gregory of Nyssa, Church Father's perspective. So being spiritual in life, vicissitudes. So with the outbreak of the pandemic, we find ourselves living a time of crisis. We overtune our lifestyle in many aspects to protect ourselves before we can reach any new scientific breakthroughs. So as pertinent as our actions are, there is something missing in the whole scenario. The challenge of COVID-19 is not something totally new, but it is a kind of like vicissitudes that we used to be very familiar with. But our memories of it has been fading away due to the development in modern science and technology. So the achievements of human civilization often affirm us that we can put everything in our control by the intellectual power that we have. Yet vicissitudes continue to persist. And now we have again the pandemic. Is it only a signal that we need further medical or scientific research, or can the pandemic tell us something more than that? So can we read COVID-19 from another lens and see it in other ways than the preventive actions we are taking now. So can we take COVID-19 as an opportunity for us to meet human situation, the divine power behind, and eventually the spiritual transformation? So in the time of the early church, when natural and political vicissitudes were more common reality than nowadays, church fathers rooted human lives on the spiritual transformation over against the infinite distance between God and man. It that intellectual challenge can be an opportunity for higher spiritual pursuit, which befits the end of intelligence. So today I want to read with you The Pandemic Anew with the light shed from one specific church father in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa. Yes. So first about Gregory. Who is him? He's the youngest of the 3 so-called Cappadocian Fathers. He is one of the 10 children of a very cultivated and well-known Christian family. So having barely received any formal education, Gregory's writings bear apparent influence of Origen's theology, Neoplatonic philosophy, and Greek rhetoric. Especially his earlier works owe much to Platonic ideas. But he started his career as a not as a theologian, but as a rhetorician, and he got married, but later showed his regrets in his exaltation of the ascetic life. In 372, his elder brother, another Cappadocian father, Basil of Caesarea, appointed him as Bishop of Nyssa. And as a bishop, he was not very successful, especially under the persecution of Emperor Valens. Gregory was accused of mishandling church finance and violation of canon law. So he retreated and was exiled in 376 from his see. And he returned in 378 after Valens was killed. Not much later after Basil's death, he continued Basil's unfinished work of defending the Nicene Creed against Arianism. His career and theological thoughts that came to their culmination at that period. Most of Gregory's literary works were produced in this period, including the ones that we will focus on today, the Against the Unknowability, and then the 2 later works. From this period on, he found his own voice in the Apophatic Theology. At the Council of Constantinople in 381, he became a strong defender of the Nicene Creed, and his profound thought and rhetorical ability impressed the emperor. And we saw he was entrusted later several honorable tasks in the rest of his life, such as delivering the funeral oration on Meletius, the Bishop of Antioch, and on the emperor's wife, Flagella, and on their little daughter, Pulcheria. In his last years, he completed his work on the life of Moses, which is a commentary on the Exodus narrative of Moses' life, and he finished his commentaries on the Song of Songs, which is a collection of his homilies on the book of Song of Songs. In these 2 works, his apophatic theology came to its spiritual flowering in his mystical theology, mysticism. So after reviewing his life, then we can see from his life journey that Gregory had various vicissitudes in his life. He faced Valens' suppression of the Nicene Church Fathers, and was exiled. And he lost his big brother Basil and lost his big sister, elder sister Magdalena, who was the spiritual light of his life. But interestingly, he matured his apophatic theology, underlying the divine unknowability only after the series of vicissitudes. Of course, the polemics he was in with Eunomius over the nature of the Son of God is a direct factor that led him to a clear formulation of apophatism. Yet, as Apophatism is not limited to his doctrinal works, but extends to his mystical works on the spiritual life in his last years, we can guess that the various vicissitudes he had in his life most likely had impacted him, together with the theological polemics he was involved in the coining of his apophatic and mystical theology. So with this premise in mind, we may find in Gregory's apophatism and mysticism a useful response to vicissitudes in life, which is relevant to the crisis now we are facing. So in the following, I want first to give an outline of Gregory's mystical theology and its relation to his apophatism, then to discuss the possible implications for life crisis now. So apophatism, which means that God in his nature is completely unknowable, as shown in, it became the key theological theme for Gregory in his defense of the divinity of the Son in his polemics with Eunomius. Eunomius adopts a literal interpretation of Jesus' words, such as, "The Father is greater than me," asserting that the Son is made by the Father as the first creature in the world. Gregory identified Eunomius' main mistake as trying to grasp the essence of the father-son relationship by human intellect, and he thinks it's wrong. In order to show that our intellect is limited, in the second book against Eunomius, Gregory reviews what we as humans can know by our natural powers, such as how the planets or stars revolving alongside each other, and the movements of the sun and moon from astronomy. But then he says, if we answer the question of the nature of the universe, that is, why and how the universe would be as it is, we find that the answer does not lie in what we can observe, but, he says, lies beyond the limits of human knowledge. Here, Gregory has distinguished two aspects of the existence of a thing: the phenomenon that we can observe and form knowledge from, and the nature of a thing in terms of why and how a thing exists as it is. According to him, the nature of anything is beyond our understanding, since it is rooted in the final cause of the world, the creator. The awareness leads Gregory to his apophatic perception of God. So if we cannot understand the natures of created things, even less likely for us to know the nature of God who granted each created being its nature. So then Gregory draws a radical distance between God as a creator and the created world. He says, as I quoted here, one is finite, the other infinite. The one is confined within its proper measure, as the wisdom of its maker determined. The limit of the other is infinity. Insofar as the intra-trinitarian relationship lies in the transcendental divine realm, it is totally beyond our intellectual grasp. For Gregory, it is this awareness that invites us to encounter God in a way radically different from our ordinary perception. So apophatism and mysticism are two main contributions from Gregory to tackle with different fields, one about ontology, the other spirituality, yet the two have a deep connection with each other in Gregory. For him, what leads one to spiritual transformation is the apophatic awakening, the moment when a person becomes aware of the limitations of human intellectual capacity in face of the transcendence and incomprehensibility of God. He explains this in his interpretation of Abraham's journey to the promised land. As other church fathers of his time, Gregory used the allegorical approach to read the Bible, and he saw Abraham's journey as an allegory of a spiritual ascent. He regards Abraham as commanding all the knowledge that are possible for human intellect. Yet when God called Abraham, Abraham was not knowing where he was going. For Gregory, knowledge does not bring Abraham an understanding of God, but instead It brings the awareness that God is beyond all that he has known. It is upon this awareness that Abraham discarded anything comprehensible and desisted from the journey towards things beyond knowing. Gregory sees this apophatic awareness arouses faith in that, so that Abraham is the example of those who are walking by faith and not by sight. In commentaries on the Song of Songs, Gregory links intellectual abandonment and faith in a more direct way, and he said, as I quote here, "I abandoned all creatures and passed by all that is intelligible in creation, and when I gave up every comprehensible mode of access, then it was that I found my beloved by faith." The apophatic awakening does not only intrigue spiritual transformation, but determines its manner as well. For Gregory, the spiritual transformation in this sense is to seek to know God by moving beyond the boundary of the mind. In his exegesis of Moses' journey to the Moses' journey, he interprets Moses entering the dark cloud on Mount Sinai as an apophatic experience of leaving behind everything that is observed, leaving behind everything that is observed, not only what sense comprehends, but also what the intellect thinks it sees. Then the mind gains access to the invisible and the incomprehensible, and there it sees God. This is the true knowledge of what is sought. This is the seeing that consists in not seeing. It is in keeping penetrating deeper into the divine darkness, while discarding all senses and reasons, that Moses gains a positive experience of seeing God in not seeing. And seeing God in not seeing as a paradoxical expression causes many difficulties in interpretation. But such a paradoxical expression also occurs in Gregory's commentaries on the Song of Songs in 6. When the bride, in her persistent curiosity of her understanding, then Gregory says, she, the bride, left behind everything she had already found, and in this way recognized the object of a search whose existence is known only in incomprehension of what it is. Some translation would say known only in unknowing, in whose case every conceptual trait is an obstacle to its discovery for those who seek it. But even though we see that what's being said about the bride here and what's being said about Moses above looks exactly the same, but interestingly, in a commentary on the Song of Songs, Gregory said something more about the bride, a more direct or more positive expression. When he comments on Song of Songs 5-C, "For my head is covered with dew and my locks with the drops of the night," then he's lingering on this image of night, and he says he understands it as the bride in her search for her beloved, that entering like Moses entering in the, discarding all her senses and all her knowledge, so in a way in the darkness. But then it says, and Gregory says, it conveys in that dark night, it conveys on the soul some perception of its presence or his presence, the bride, the bridegrooms. But it escapes clear and distinct intellectual grasp in being concealed by the invisibility of its nature. So there is a positive encounter expressed here in some perception of its presence, but at the same time, Gregory says it's not the sensual or intellectual perception, and it's even not a clear perception, because it is clear, it escapes clear and distinct intellectual grasp. So how to explain, how to interpret these? In scholarship, there are mainly two ways of interpreting these so-called Theophanies. One way of interpretation is to see the encounter with God as an intimacy with God in the sense of the divine dwelling in the soul, and it is achieved by means of something transcending the intellect, which is in participation through faith. Another way of interpretation is to see the spiritual transformation as a perpetual progress in understanding of God, but with no immediate vision of God at any moment. And in my view, these two different interpretations do not necessarily collide, since many of the different aspects of the same spiritual transformation, the same process. I'll explain by going further into Gregory's spiritual theology. Those who see Moses' theophany as an intimacy with God by manner of participation look at Gregory's treatment of human beings being the image and likeness of God, made to the image and likeness of God in Genesis 1:26. We can understand it with a paragraph in his homilies on the Beatitudes. And I've quoted here: God has imprinted upon your constitution relics of the good things in his own nature, as those damping wax with the shape of a design. Vice, however, overlaying the godlike pattern, has made the good useless to you, hidden under curtains of shame. If you were to wash away once more by scrupulous living the filth that has accumulated upon your heart, the godlike beauty would again light up for you. So our likeness with God lies in the structure of being human, that is, being rational and virtuous. So the good things here means the mind, the intellect, and the virtues. In living rational and virtuous life, we can reflect God's beauty and glory as a mirror. Yet after the fall, in the corrupted nature, we lost the likeness with God and so became incapable of reflecting the divine image, just as a mirror blurred by dirt cannot reflect. Therefore, we have to remove impurity on the soul to be able to embody the divine beauty in virtues again. The idea of living virtuous life as being the image of God points to the idea of participation in Gregory. In the 5th chapter of the Catechetical Origin, Gregory says that the purpose of granting human beings the likeness with God is for them to be able to participate in the divine life. So he says as this, that then it was needful for the human being, having come to be for the enjoyment of divine good, to have something in his nature akin to that in which he is to participate. For this end, he has been furnished with life, with reason, with wisdom, and with all the excellences that we attribute to God. The idea of participation originates in the Platonic tradition. Plato divided the world into the realm of ideas where we have the perfect real beings of all kinds, and the copies or images on the lower level of reality in the world. Images in the lower reality reflect the higher reality by way of participation. In other words, participation is to share the likeness with the archetype, so that the likeness which belongs to the being of the archetype come to present in the image in a derived and imperfect way. For Gregory, since virtues are the likeness between man and God, living virtuous life is to participate in the being of God. And in the moral philosophy, Plato suggests that to know virtue is, in the real sense, is to practice them. So, for example, knowing courage is to be courageous. In the similar vein, Gregory asserts that to participate in the being of God is the real way of knowing God. So participation is a real way of knowing God. In homily 6 on the Beatitudes, he says, that to see God is to possess him, and to possess him is to participate in him. In addition, in this regard, participation is a way that is a participation is a higher way of knowing than God than intellectual knowing. So he says, the Lord does not say that knowing something about God is blessed, but to possess God in oneself. So in this sense, participation is a more direct way of knowing God, and on the contrary, intelligible knowledge is mediated by intellect. It reveals something about God, but at the same time, it creates a gap between us and God. Therefore, participation as a way of knowing God presupposes a prophetic awareness and faith. It also means abandoning intellectual knowledge, adhering to faith, and participation are three aspects of the same spiritual process that he is intrigued by the apophatic awareness. In this sense, Moses' mystical experience of seeing in not seeing, and the bride's knowing in not knowing, and even some sense of the divine presence, are as an intimacy with God in participation, are not different in nature than any part of the spiritual journey, which is a process of participation, but are participation realized in a more intensive or conscious way. However, the paradoxical expression seeing in not seeing and knowing in not knowing implies another aspect of the Theophanies, which the second way of interpreting the Theophanies by the scholars have touched. The second way views the Theophanies of Moses and the bride as implying no intensive mystical experience of God, but simply an awareness of the insufficiency of the soul's present knowledge of God. So we can see it in the quotation as well. Like, after saying that the bride come to a knowledge in incomprehension, and then he said, in whose case every conceptual trait is an obstacle to its discovery for those who seek it. So a conceptual intellectual knowledge of God is at the same time an obstacle. When Gregory says that the bride, her soul, obtains some perception of the divine presence, then he immediately says, but it escapes clear and distinct intellectual grasp in being concealed by the invisibility of its nature. Again, once you get a present, you get a perception, a sense of God. Again, you immediately realize it escaped your grasp, it escaped your understanding, your knowledge, and is concealed in incomprehensibility or in invisibility. So it is, in this sense, the second way of interpreting the Theophanies would see there's no real intermediacy between God and man. But what Gregory expresses here is that the spiritual transformation is a perpetual progress of getting ever higher understanding of God. So there, then it is the right moment to talk about the three stages or moments of the spiritual transformation in Gregory. Traditionally, we have in the West the idea of the stages of spiritual growth: purification, contemplation, illumination. We can see these present in Origen, in Augustine. However, Gregory uses many similar concepts. At times, it also seems to indicate the three stages, such as when summarizing Moses' life in commentary on the Song of Songs. But most of the time in Gregory's works, the three stages are not clear or not in a clear-cut order. It arouses this fact arouses scholars' interest in discussing the nature of the three stages in Gregory's works, such as Cappadocian Fathers, one of the very beginning of Gregory's scholar, thinks the three are three ways, not stages, that are not necessarily coming in the successive order. And other more recent scholars would identify these three as three moments or dialectic circles that can overlap with each other. In my view, the difficulty of defining the three stages or three elements reveals the unique nature of Gregory's spiritual theology. I'm one of the more recent scholars, but I would understand with the term three aspects or levels. In each moment of the spiritual transformation, there are the three aspects, or at least two of them, always together. So in concrete terms, we'll say for a spiritual transformation, there's an aspect of action, which is practicing virtues as a way to purify oneself from passions and false ideas, and an aspect of contemplation, which is the spiritual growth always accompanies and results in a better understanding of the divine mystery. And there's an aspect of relationship, which is the indescribable intimacy, which is formulated as union in human language. The third aspect of union only occurs in the intensive moments, yet virtuous life is a lifelong way of living, and contemplation or understanding is never absent in any of the three moments of the spiritual. Therefore, indeed, for Gregory, there are no clear-cut stages on the spiritual journey, but perpetual participation resulting in a constant progress in virtue and in understanding. In this process, there are moments of intensive sense of the divine presence. So if viewing the three moments as unity as such, we can understand the two interpretations, the two way of interpreting the Theophanies in Gregory as not as compatible to each other. For example, in the most intensive moment of intimacy with God, which is a non-discursive mystic feeling, so I put it as intimate relation, will yield to some intellectual understanding of the feeling. Yet at the same time, the intensity and the profoundness of the feeling will contrast the plainness of the understanding, and therefore leads to the awareness of the nothingness of the understanding. So you can see in this process, understanding and the relationship, the intensive relationship, is working together. So the aspect of intellectual understanding and the aspect of building a relationship in the participation actually goes hand to hand in Gregory. So, aside from the mystic experience, the spiritual transformation in general is guided by the apophatic awareness. It is indeed Gregory's ceaseless emphasis that spiritual transformation is an overturning of our ordinary way of living and knowing. However, his idea is not to abandon intellectual activity in the world totally, but if we see that the spiritual journey is actually the three aspects working together, then for him, his idea is for us to be aware of the limits of knowledge and of our mind, and to ground our lives in what is essential, that is participation in the being of God. Yet, with the inclination to fully grasp everything intellectually as a human, and to not satisfy with intellectual knowledge, but to pursue God in participation, is against the human habit, and therefore not an easy way to keep, especially when more intellectual understanding are achieved. Therefore, for Gregory, the spiritual journey can move on constantly only when our intellectual satisfaction be constantly beset by intellectual failure. In Against Eunomius 2, Gregory sees Abraham as an exempling those who came to the apophatic awareness because they were walking by faith and not by sight. In the context of the Trinitarian debate, Gregory contrasts faith and sight so as to stress that what arouses apophatic awareness has to be some truth that besetting reason, and the mystery of the Trinity is exactly one of this kind. The mistake of Eunomius then lies exactly in trying to understand divine mystery with human mind, and in doing so, Eunomius took away the stumbling block which reminds us of what matters most in our relationship with God, the faith. And in Life of Moses, when interpreting Moses' Theophany in the Divine Darkness, Gregory sees that it is a negative experience of knowing what is divine is beyond all knowledge and comprehension. That moves Moses to penetrate further into the divine mystery by discarding sensual and intellectual perceptions. Reading in the light of Gregory's Apophatism, intellectual failures are not accidental, but God's way of keeping us on the spiritual transformation. Due to the infinite distance between God and man, no matter how much we have progressed on the spiritual transformation, God is always infinitely far beyond us. Here comes Gregory's idea of epictasis, which asserts that our spiritual transformation will be a perpetual progress which continues even after the end of this life. To ensure the progress goes on continuously, God would constantly put us in situations which can arouse our apophatic awareness. Gregory expressed this idea in his interpretation of Moses seeing Yahweh's back in a cleft of a rock. The Theophany comes in the context of Moses yearning to see God face to face, but instead of showing Moses his face directly, Yahweh asked Moses to go into a hole of a rock, and Moses saw Yahweh's back while Yahweh passing by. Gregory thinks that the fact that Yahweh showed Moses his back instead of his face is to put Moses to despair, so that in the apophatic experience of not seeing, Moses can continue chasing God in a way beyond seeing and understanding. This manner of God's interaction with us is reflected in the bride's experience in the Song of Songs in a similar vein. In the dark night, when nothing is visible, the bridegroom granted the bride a sense of his own presence, which is not an intelligible vision, but a feeling which arouses the bride's awareness of the infinite gap between what the bride has known of the bridegroom and who he really is. And this experience pushes the bride to keep searching for her beloved by discarding what she has already known of him. After this introduction to Gregory's idea of spiritual transformation, now I want to speak something about how it can help us cope with the crisis we are now facing. So firstly, how Gregory defends God as unknown in Against Eunomius 2 resonates the discussion of the nature of modern science in the 20th century. So Gregory's apophatism can help us to read the crisis of COVID-19 as revealing the limitation of science. So in arguing for the radical ontological gulf between God and man, Gregory made the division between intellectual phenomena and intelligible phenomena and unintelligible nature of created beings, which echoes the distinction between science and religion made by the 20th century theologians. So, as natural science deals with data retrieved from the phenomenal world, for the purpose of looking for connections between phenomena, and therefore it cannot answer the question of essence and has no power over the fundamental relationships between man and world and of nature, as well as man and God. As one branch of natural science, medicine has the same limited nature, and COVID-19 has testified it. No matter how advanced it is, medical science only modifies our relationship with the natural world based on the relationship it observed between phenomena, but it cannot alter the nature of human life and the natural world given by God. Since the invention of vaccine modified our relationship with viruses, but it cannot change the fact that we are created as imperfect and vulnerable creatures whose lives face constant threat from certain other creatures in the natural world. COVID-19 has testified that the threat has never been eliminated. A proper attitude towards medical achievements and natural threat should entail the apophatic awareness of human intellectual boundary. In this sense, the crisis of COVID-19 can be a stumbling block that awakens us to the limitation of the intellectual power, seeing that our intelligence cannot alter our essential relation with the natural world, which is built in the very nature of us. Therefore, the crisis can open our eyes to the final cause that determines our nature, the Creator, and leads us to keep anchoring our lives in our relationship with the Almighty One, which is realized in the spiritual transformation. So as a crisis, COVID-19 means a lot in itself, but more than in itself as well. It embodies the vicissitudes that we always have to meet and never be able to escape. If, as Gregory understands it, God constantly puts us in despair so as to awaken us to our intellectual limits and to constantly lead us to the transcendent way of knowing Him beyond seeing and knowing, then can COVID-19 and all other vicissitudes in our lives are allowed by God so that we can take them as chances to the apophatic awakening and spiritual transformation. As much as our desire to control everything by our intellectual power, the uncertainty that frustrates our certain ambition never stop coming back. Viewing from the transcendent perspective, they definitely have some positive meanings, not simply in stimulating greater scientific and technological achievement, but more in inviting us to keep anchoring in Him and to move forward on the spiritual transformation. Thirdly, Gregory's idea of the spiritual transformation as an orchestra of three layers together: virtuous life, intellectual understanding, and mystical relationship with God, means that in seeing the limits of medical science or natural science in general, the point is not to abandon science once and for all. For Gregory, intellectual understanding always accompanies participation in God. We cannot increase our understanding of God without understanding the world that He created. That is the reason why Gregory does not devalue scientific achievements for their own right. In fact, his conversance with the contemporary scientific knowledge witnesses his huge interest in natural science. On the soul and the resurrection, he spent pages after pages on the contemporary astronomy and medicine. But he thought that the ultimate goal of knowing the world and the natural world is not to make life on earth easier, but to know about the soul, the goal of the Logos, and eventually the Creator behind the creation. It also means that in studying the natural world, we should never lose the vision of the invisible hand behind it. For Gregory, understanding and spiritual transformation should be together hand in hand. This brings us to our last point. In Gregory, the three layers of spiritual transformation grounds in the one activity of participation. It implies that the spiritual transformation is nothing other than anchoring our lives, not on knowledge that we get, but on our relationship with God in living out our likeness with Him in virtues, wisdom, and so on. So the spiritual transformation is not a separate life it's not a separate life path into which that we devote ourselves. since for Gregory, the spiritual transformation has always the negative side of apophatic awareness, the intellectual side of understanding, and the positive side of participation together. It means that we can achieve the spiritual transformation right now, right here in the world, in the middle of the crisis, and in striving for further scientific breakthroughs and preventive actions to improve lives, as long as we ground ourselves in our relationship with God, in faith, in participation, as long as whatever science or scientific or technological achievement we have attained, we take them as showing the limitation of our knowledge in comparing with the feeling or our relationship with God we came up with in the process of participation. So this is my reflection on how Gregory can help us to see to tackle with the crisis that we are in now. So having said this, in general, I think the essential idea for Gregory is that we base our lives in our relation with God in this participation, but this participation doesn't just mean a feeling and doesn't just mean an intimacy. It also means that it will always yield to us an intellectual understanding, and it will always pushes us to more intellectual understanding, more intellectual search for God in the world or beyond. And so it brings us to, or brings me to last point, thing that I want to share with you. Yeah, it's to testify that how much that I've learned from Gregory to continue this work of intellectual search for God is, I think things we always find, or we should always know that our understanding God is always inadequate, and we should always strive to know more about God, to discover more of his mystery. So, and at the same time, this is on our side, on God's side. God is always granting us various life situations. Vicissitudes is one, and the other living situations, which prompts us to launch new or further search for understanding him. So for mankind now, this is the pandemic, as we already discussed. And now for us here, there's in Macau or in China, there's another special situation in that we are situated in a culture that is so different from the culture where Christianity have originally obtained the expressions of its essential doctrines. So this special situation we're in may provide us with new perspectives of understanding Christian faith. As we have mentioned for Gregory of Nyssa, the Trinity is a mystery that is beyond the grasp of intellectual light. In another way of speaking, it is a golden mine in which we can endlessly dig out a freshly new vision of God. Granted that we look at it constantly with new perspectives. With this idea in mind, Father Victor and I have been preparing now a project working with the Reach Institute in Macau, initiated by Father Roslin, on elaborating Trinitarian theology to Chinese readers, and exploring the possible contribution of Chinese culture or philosophy to the explication of the idea of Trinity. So the huge cultural difference between China and the West makes a proper expression of Trinitarian theology in Chinese an incredibly challenging task. We use the Trinitarian terms in Chinese such as 一体三位, but an accurate grasp of its essential meaning is lacking. It is due to the difference of language and different philosophical frameworks. So what essentially important is to clarify the original meaning that's essential for understanding the Trinitarian doctrines, such as the terms as usia hypostasis, generation, procession, and the philosophical and theological ideas behind them. And at the same time, the key mystery revealed in the Trinity the Trinitarian relationship, is something difficult to understand even in its original language, but deeply meaningful for Christian faith as well. While now, with Chinese culture and language so much emphasizing on dynamics and on relationship, the essential idea in Trinity that is difficult to express in the Western languages may get another inspirational expression in Chinese. That is how this project has come into our mind. We hope to clarify essential ideas or concepts in the Trinitarian theology to Chinese readers by using language that makes sense in Chinese context. And at the same time, in this process, we want to discover the potential contribution that Chinese culture can offer to the understanding of Trinity. So here I want to share this new project with you, and I hope that you can find it interesting as I find it. Okay, thank you for your attention, and yeah, and thanks for being here today. So yes, end of my sharing.